Chapter 13. Hercule Poirot stepped from a taxi at 26 Hickory Road. The door was opened by Geronimo.
"Is Mrs. Hubbard in?"
"I take you upstairs to her."
"A little moment."
Poirot stopped him.
"Do you remember the day when certain electric light bulbs disappeared?"
"Yes, I remember."
"Exactly what bulbs were taken?"
"The one in the hall, and I think in the common room."
"Do you remember the date?"
Geronimo thought. "I think it was on the day when a policeman come, sometime in February."
"A policeman? What did a policeman come here for?"
"He come here to see Mrs. Nicoletis about a man who murdered a woman somewhere else."
"And that was the day the bulbs were missing?"
"Yes, because I turn a switch and nothing happen, and I look in drawer for more, and I see bulbs have gone. So I use just candles." Poirot thought about this as he followed Geronimo up to Mrs. Hubbard's room. She was looking very tired and held out a piece of paper to him. "I've done my best to write down these things in the proper order, but I'm not sure that it's completely accurate."
"I am deeply grateful to you, madame."
Poirot looked at the piece of paper.
"I see now that the rucksack is first. You had, I believe, a visit from the police here, and it was after that you found the rucksack?"
"Yes. Len Bateson was going off on a hitchhike, and he couldn't find his rucksack anywhere, and everyone looked, and at last Geronimo found it behind the boiler, all cut up. So strange and pointless, Monsieur Poirot."
"Yes, strange and pointless."
Poirot paused.
"How soon after this did the stealing begin?"
"I think, yes, Geneviève said she had missed her bracelet about a week after that, between the 20th and the 25th of February."
"And after that the stealing went on?"
"Yes."
"And this rucksack, was Len Bateson very angry about it?"
"Yes, but Len is that type of boy, Monsieur Poirot," said Mrs. Hubbard, smiling. "He's also very generous and kind."
"What was it, this rucksack? Something special?"
"Oh, no, it was just ordinary."
"Could you show me one like it?"
"Of course. Colin's got one. So has Nigel. In fact, Len's got one again now, because he had to go and buy another. They get them at the shop at the end of the road. It's much cheaper than any of the big stores." Mrs. Hubbard led him to Colin McNab's room, opened the cupboard, and picked up a rucksack.
"It would take some strength to cut that,"
said Poirot. "Oh, yes, strength and, well, anger, you know."
"I know, yes. It is not pleasant."
Then, when later that scarf of Valerie's was found, also cut to pieces, well, it did look unbalanced.
"Ah,"
said Poirot.
"But I think there you are wrong, madame. I do not think there is anything unbalanced about this business. I think it has purpose, and shall we say, method. You say that these rucksacks are bought at the shop at the end of the road?
Yes. Poirot thanked Mrs. Hubbard, then left the house and walked down Hickory Road until he came to the shop. In the window was a lot of sports equipment. Poirot entered and said he would like to buy a rucksack for his nephew who was going hitchhiking. The man said,
"Oh, hitchhiking. They all do it nowadays. All over Europe some of these young people go. Now, here is the usual one we sell. Good, strong, and really very cheap,"
he said as he wrapped it up. Poirot paid him and went out with his package. He had only gone a step or two when he felt a hand on his shoulder.
"Just the man I want to see," said Inspector Sharp. "There's a place along here where you can get a cup of coffee, if you're not busy."
The place was almost empty. The men carried their cups to a small table in a corner, and Sharp told Poirot the results of his interviews with the students.
"The only person we've got any evidence against is Chapman," he said. "And there we've got too much. 3 lots of poison in his possession. But I doubt he would have been as honest about his activities if he was guilty."
And your hunt through the house, did you find anything?
Patricia Lane, in her drawer, had a handkerchief covered in green ink.
Green ink? Poirot said. Patricia Lane. So it may have been she who spilled it over Elizabeth Johnston's papers and then wiped her hands afterwards. But surely...
"Surely she wouldn't want her dear Nigel to be suspected." Sharp finished for him.
But of course, someone else might have put the handkerchief in her drawer. Anything else?
"Well, it seems Leonard Bateson's father is in a mental hospital. Bateson's a nice fellow, but his temper is a bit, well, uncontrolled."
Poirot nodded. Suddenly he remembered Celia Austin saying that it wasn't her who cut up the rucksack, that it was done with anger. How did she know it was done with anger? Had she seen Len Bateson attacking that rucksack?
"But we didn't find what we wanted. No forged passports."
You cannot really expect such a thing as a false passport to be left about for you to find, my good friend. Things will only make sense if we begin at the beginning.
"What do you call the beginning, Poirot?"
The rucksack, said Poirot softly. All this began with a rucksack.
Chapter 14.
"I shall come in as usual on Monday,"
said Mrs. Nicolettis to Mrs. Hubbard.
"I want new electric light bulbs put in the dark passages. Stronger ones."
But you said especially that you wanted low-power bulbs for economy.
"That was last week,"
said Mrs. Nicolettis.
"Now it is different. Now I look over my shoulder and I wonder who is following me."
Mrs. Hubbard said, "Are you sure you ought to go home by yourself?"
"I shall be safer there than here, I can tell you."
But what is it you are afraid of? If I knew, perhaps, I could—
I tell you nothing. It is not your business.
I'm sorry. I'm sure—
Now you are offended.
Mrs. Nicolettis gave her a wide smile.
But remember, I trust you, dear Mrs. Hubbard. Good night.
Mrs. Nicolettis went out of the front door, down the steps to the gate, and turned to the left. At the end of Hickory Road there were traffic lights on the corner, and a public house, the Queen's Head. Mrs. Nicolettis walked in the middle of the path, and occasionally looked over her shoulder, but there was no one there. When she reached the Queen's Head, after another quick look, she stepped inside. Sipping a double brandy, she felt better, then turned violently as a voice behind her said, "Why, Mrs. Nick, I didn't know you came here."
Oh, it's you,
she said.
I thought—
Who did you think it was? Some big bad man? What are you drinking? I'll get you another.
It is all the worry,
Mrs. Nicolettis explained.
These policemen searching my house. I do not like drinking, but I just thought a little brandy.
Nothing like brandy. Here you are. Mrs. Nicolettis left the Queen's Head a short while later, feeling positively happy. One brandy less, perhaps, would have been wise, but why shouldn't a lady have a quiet drink sometimes? And if they complained, then she would tell them that she knew a thing or two. So, if she decided to talk— Mrs. Nicolettis stepped sharply aside to avoid a postbox. Her head did feel a little strange. Perhaps if she just leant against the wall here for a little— if she closed her eyes for a moment or two. Hercule Poirot was in his sitting room. Neatly arranged on the table were 4 rucksacks, the result of instructions given to his servant, George. Poirot took the rucksack he had bought the day before and added it to the others. It did not seem any different from them, but it was very much cheaper. He examined them all very carefully, inside and outside, turning them upside down, feeling the seams, the pockets, the handles. Then he picked up a small sharp knife, and turning the rucksack he had bought at Mr. Hicks's shop inside out, he attacked the bottom of it. Between the inner lining and the bottom there was a heavy piece of cloth. Poirot looked at the rucksack with extreme interest. Then he began to attack the other rucksacks. Finally, he sat back and took out the new list that Mrs. Hubbard had given him. It was as follows: Rucksack, Len Bateson's. Electric light bulbs. Bracelet, Genevieve's. Diamond ring, Patricia's. Powder compact, Genevieve's. Evening shoe, Sally's. Lipstick, Elizabeth Johnston's. Earrings, Valerie's. Stethoscope, Len Bateson's. Bath salts. Scarf cut in pieces, Valerie's. Trousers, Collins. Cookery book. Boracic, Chandra Lal's.
Costume brooch, Sally's. Ink spilled on Elizabeth's notes. This is the best I can do, L. Hubbard. Poirot looked at it for a long time, then said to himself,
Yes, we have to eliminate the things that do not matter.
He had an idea of who could help him. It was Sunday, so most of the students would be at home. He phoned 26 Hickory Road. A short time later, Geronimo opened the door and led the way upstairs into a good-sized room overlooking Hickory Road. The bed was decorated with a silk cover, and there was some attractive old furniture.
Well, you have made this place very nice, Miss Hobhouse,
said Poirot.
It has style.
Valerie smiled. I've been here a long time, so I've got some of my own things.
You are not a student, are you, mademoiselle?
Oh, no. I'm one of the buyers for Sabrina Fair. It's a beauty salon. Actually, I have a small share in the business. We also sell a few small things from Paris, and that's my department.
You go over fairly often to Paris?
About once a month, sometimes more. Please do sit down, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot sat in a high-backed chair. Valerie sat on the bed. She had a nervous, rather tired beauty, and he wondered if her nervousness was the result of the recent inquiry, or whether it was a part of her usual manner.
Inspector Sharp has been asking questions of you?
He asked.
Yes. And you have told him all that you know?
Of course.
I wonder, he said, if that is true.
She gave him a humorous look. Since you did not hear my answers, you can't know anything about it.
Ah, it is just one of my little ideas. I have them, you know, the little ideas. They are here.
He touched his head. But Valerie did not smile as he had expected. Why don't you get to the point, Monsieur Poirot? I really don't know what it is you want.
But certainly, Miss Hobhouse.
He took from his pocket a little package.
You can guess, perhaps, what I have in here?
I'm not a fortune-teller, Monsieur Poirot.
I have here the ring that was stolen from Miss Patricia Lane.
Her mother's engagement ring? But why do you have it?
I asked her to lend it to me. I took it to a jeweller friend of mine, and I asked him to report on a diamond. A large stone with some small stones on either side. You remember, mademoiselle?
Not very well.
But it was in your soup plate.
That was how it was returned. I remember that. I nearly swallowed it. Valerie gave a short laugh.
Do you know what my friend said about the stone?
How could I?
He said that the stone was not a diamond. It was just a zircon.
Oh. Do you mean that Patricia thought it was a diamond, but it was only a zircon, or... Poirot was shaking his head.
No, I do not mean that. Miss Lane is a young lady of good family, and I am certain that the papa of Miss Lane would not have given her mamma anything but a valuable engagement ring. Therefore, it seems that the stone must have been changed for another stone later.
I suppose, said Valerie, that Pat might have lost the stone out of it, couldn't afford another diamond, so had a zircon put in instead.
That is possible, but I do not think it is what happened.
Well, what do you think happened?
I think that the ring was taken by Mademoiselle Celia, and that the diamond was removed and the zircon put there before the ring was returned.
Valerie sat up very straight. You think that Celia stole that diamond? Poirot shook his head.
No. I think you stole it, mademoiselle.
Well, really, you have no evidence for saying that?
But yes, Poirot interrupted her, I have evidence. The ring was returned in a plate of soup. Now, I dined here one evening, and the soup was served from a pot on the side table. Therefore, if anyone found a ring in their soup plate, it could only have been placed there either by the person who was serving the soup, in this case Geronimo, or by the person whose soup plate it was. You. I think that you arranged the return of the ring in the soup in that way because it amused you. To hold up the ring, to pretend great surprise. I think you did not understand that you told the truth about yourself by so doing.
Is that all? Valerie spoke coldly.
Oh, no. You see, when Celia spoke of this ring, she said, I didn't know how valuable it was as soon as I knew I returned it. Who told her how valuable the ring was? And then, when she spoke of the cut scarf, Celia said something like, Valerie didn't mind. Why did you not mind? I formed the idea then that the plan of pretending to be a kleptomaniac and so attracting the attention of Colin McNab had been thought out for Celia by someone else. You told her the ring was valuable, you took it from her and arranged its return. In the same way, it was you who suggested that she cut a scarf of yours to pieces.
Valerie gave a short laugh. You're quite right. It was all my idea.
May I ask you why?
Oh, there was Celia, so in love with Colin, who never looked at her. It all seemed so silly. So I spoke to her and explained the idea. She was a bit nervous, but rather excited at the same time. Then, of course, one of the first things the stupid girl does is to take Pat's ring. A really valuable piece of jewellery which might mean that the police would be called in. So I told her I would return it somehow, and that she must just take cheap things and perhaps do a little damage to something of mine which wouldn't get her into trouble. Poirot drew a deep breath.
That was exactly what I thought. And now we come to this business of Patricia's ring. Before returning it to her, what happened? You were short of money, was that it?
Without looking at him, she nodded. The trouble is, Monsieur Poirot, I'm a gambler. I belong to a little club in Mayfair, and I've lost rather a lot recently. Then I thought, if this diamond was replaced with a white zircon, Pat would never know the difference. So I sold the diamond and replaced it with a zircon. There. Now you know it all. But honestly, I never meant Celia to be blamed for it. No, I understand, Poirot said. But you made a great mistake, mademoiselle. I know that, said Valerie. Then she cried out, But what does that matter now? Tell the police if you like. Tell Pat. Tell the world. But how's it going to help us find out who killed Celia? Poirot stood up. One never knows what may help and what may not. But I suggest that you go to Miss Patricia Lane and tell her what you did. Valerie did not look happy. All right, and I'll tell her that when I can afford it, I'll buy her another diamond. The door opened suddenly, and Mrs. Hubbard came in. She was breathing fast, and her expression made Valerie ask, What's the matter, Mum? What's happened? It's Mrs. Nicolettis. Mrs. Nick? What about her? Oh, my dear, she's dead. Dead? Valerie's voice sounded rough. How? When? She was found in the street last night. They took her to the police station. They thought she was drunk, I suppose. Yes, she had been drinking. But anyway, she died. Poor old Mrs. Nick, said Valerie. Poirot said gently, You were fond of her, mademoiselle? It's strange, but yes, I was. When I first came here, she wasn't nearly as difficult as she became later. She was funny, warm-hearted. She's changed a lot in the last year. Mrs. Hubbard said, I do blame myself, letting her go off home alone last night. She was afraid of something. Afraid? Poirot and Valerie said it together. Mrs. Hubbard nodded. Yes, she kept saying she wasn't safe. I asked her to tell me what she was afraid of, and she refused. Now, I wonder. Valerie said, You don't think that she, too, was... She stopped, a look of fear in her eyes. Poirot asked, What did they say was the cause of death? Mrs. Hubbard said, They didn't say. There will be an inquest on Tuesday. Chapter 15. In a quiet room at Scotland Yard, 4 men were sitting round a table. The policemen were Superintendent Wilding of the Drugs Division, Sergeant Bell, and Inspector Sharp. The 4th man was Hercule Poirot. On the table was a rucksack. "It's an interesting idea, Monsieur Poirot," Superintendent Wilding said. "Smuggling goes on all the time, of course. There's been a lot of heroin coming into this country in the last year and a half." "And what about other things, such as jewels?" Sergeant Bell spoke. "There's a lot of it going on, sir." Superintendent Wilding said, "But, Monsieur Poirot, what is it you're interested in? Drugs or jewels?" "Either.
anything of great value but small in size. There is an opportunity, it seems to me, for what you might call a transport service carrying things across the channel. It could be a small independent organization unconnected with selling the things, and the profits might be high.
You're right about that.
You see, said Poirot, the weakness of the smuggler is always that sooner or later you suspect a person, an air hostess, a sailing enthusiast, the woman who travels to France too often. But if the things are brought into this country by a different person each time, then it is very difficult to find the drugs or jewels.
Wilding pointed at the rucksack. And that is how you think it is done?
Yes. Who is going to suspect a student travelling about with just a rucksack on his back? And the great cleverness of the arrangement is that the carriers know nothing about what they are doing.
How exactly do you think it's managed? Wilding asked.
I think that it worked roughly like this. First, some rucksacks are made. They look ordinary, just like any other rucksack, but the lining at the bottom is different. As you see, it can easily be removed, and below is a space where jewels or drugs could be hidden.
Wilding said, you could bring in drugs worth £5,000 or £6,000 each time, without anyone knowing.
Exactly, said Hercule Poirot. The rucksacks are made and put in probably more than one shop for sale. There is, of course, probably someone who is himself a student who is in charge of the whole thing. Students travel. At some point on a return journey, a rucksack that looks just the same is exchanged. The student returns to England, arrives back at the hostel, unpacks, and the empty rucksack is thrown into a corner. At this point, the rucksack will again be exchanged.
And you think that's what happened at Hickory Road?
Poirot nodded. That is my suspicion, yes.
But what made you think of it, Monsieur Poirot?
A rucksack was cut to pieces. Why? It was hard work, and someone must have been very anxious to do it. I got my clue when I found that the rucksack was destroyed at the time when a police officer called to see the person in charge of the hostel. The officer's call concerned another matter. But suppose you are someone involved in this smuggling. You immediately think that the police have come about the smuggling, and suppose that at that moment there is in the house a rucksack just brought back from abroad containing drugs. If there are drugs or jewels in the house, they can be hidden in bath salts. But even an empty rucksack, if it had held drugs, might show signs of heroin if it was examined, so the rucksack must be destroyed.
It is an idea, as I said before, said Superintendent Wilding.
It also seems possible that some missing light bulbs may be connected with the rucksack. Perhaps someone was frightened that his face might be known to the police if they saw him in a bright light. So he removed the bulb from the hall light and took away the new ones so that it could not be replaced.
But if what you say is true, said Wilding. "It must go beyond just Hickory Road."
Poirot nodded. Oh, yes. The organization must involve many students' hostels.
"You have to find a connection between them," said Wilding. Inspector Sharp spoke for the first time. "There is such a connection, sir. Or there was. A woman who owned several hostels, Mrs. Nicolettis."
Yes, said Poirot, but I suspect she was not in charge of the whole operation.
Said Wilding. "It would be interesting to know more about Mrs. Nicolettis. Where is she?"
"She's dead, sir," said Sharp.
"Dead?"
Wilding's eyes widened.
"Yes, we'll know for certain after she's been examined, but I think it could have been murder." "And Celia Austin, did she know something?"
She knew something, said Poirot, but I do not think she knew what it was she knew. So perhaps she mentioned the fact without understanding that it was important.
"Have you any idea what she knew?"
There has been mention of a passport. Did someone in the house have a false passport that allowed them to travel with another name? Did she see someone removing the false bottom from the rucksack? Did she perhaps see the person who removed the light bulbs? Guesses, guesses, guesses. One must know more.
"Well," said Sharp, "we can start by investigating Mrs. Nicolettis's involvement. But you say she was not in charge of the organisation. Have you any idea, Monsieur Poirot, who that might be?"
I could make a guess. I might be wrong. Yes, I might be wrong.
Chapter 16.
"Please, Sally, may I ask you a question?"
Sally and Akibombo were having lunch together in a restaurant in Regent's Park.
"All this morning,"
said Akibombo sadly,
"I have been very upset. I cannot answer my professor's questions at all. He is not pleased with me. But I find it very hard to think, except of what goes on at Hickory Road."
I understand, said Sally. I feel the same.
"So that is why I am asking you, please to tell me certain things. This boracic, it is an acid, they say. Something very strong."
No, it's harmless.
"You mean you could put it in your eyes?"
That's right. That's what people use it for.
"Ah, that explains that then. Mr. Chandralal, he has little white bottle with white powder, and he puts powder in hot water and washes his eyes with it. He keeps it in bathroom, and then it was not there one day and he was very angry. That would be boracic."
What is all this about boracic?
"I'll tell you later. I need to think some more about it."
Well, don't go around telling everyone, said Sally. I don't want yours to be the next dead body, Akibombo. Valerie, do you think you could give me some advice? Said Jean. It's about doing the right thing. Then I'm the last person you should ask. I never do the right thing. Well, not often.
Oh, Valerie, don't say things like that. But suppose you know something about someone. Should you tell the police? What a stupid question. You can't answer something like that in general terms. What is it you want to tell, or don't want to tell? It's about a passport. A passport? Valerie sat up. Whose passport? Nigel's. He's got a false passport. I don't believe it. But he has. And Valerie, suppose Celia found out about it, and he killed her. Sounds very unlikely. But how did you see Nigel's passport? Well, I was looking for something in my case, and by mistake I must have looked in Nigel's case. They were both in the common room. Valerie laughed rather unkindly. What were you hoping to find? Nothing. I just wasn't thinking properly. So I opened the case, and I was just sorting through it. Jean, that's nonsense. Nigel's case is much bigger than yours, and it's a different colour. So, all right, you found a chance to look through Nigel's things, and you did. Jean stood up. If you're going to be unpleasant, I shall— Oh, sit down, said Valerie. I'm getting interested now. Well, there was this passport, and it had a name on it, Stanford or Stanley, and I thought, how strange that Nigel has somebody else's passport. I opened it, and the photograph inside was Nigel. Valerie laughed. Bad luck, Jean. There's a simple explanation. Pat told me that Nigel was left some money on the condition that he changed his name. So that's all it is. His original name was Stanfield or Stanley or something like that. Oh. Jean looked very disappointed. Better luck next time, said Valerie. I don't know what you mean. You would like to get Nigel in trouble with the police. You may not believe me, Valerie, but all I wanted to do was my duty, Jean said, and left the room. Nigel, I've got something I must tell you. What is it, Pat? Nigel was looking urgently inside his chest of drawers. What did I do with my notes? Oh, Nigel, you must listen. I've got to tell the truth about something. Not murder, I hope? Nigel laughed. Hickory-dickory-dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The police said, boo! I wonder who will eventually stand in the dock. No, of course not. But one day, when I had mended your socks and was putting them away in your drawer— Yes? And the bottle of morphia was there, the one you told me about, Nigel. It was there in your drawer where anybody could have found it. Why? Nobody else looks amongst my socks except you. Well, I thought it was wrong, so I took the bottle out of the drawer, and I emptied the poison out of it, and I replaced it with some bicarbonate of soda. You mean that when I told Len and Colin that it was morphine, it was just bicarbonate of soda? But that might make the bet no good. Nigel, it was really dangerous keeping it there. So, what did you do with the morphine? I put it in the bicarbonate of soda bottle, and I hid it at the back of my handkerchief drawer. Nigel shook his head.
Really, Pat, do you really have a brain? What was the point?
I felt it was safer there. I have a room of my own, and you share yours. I wasn't going to tell you about it, ever, but I must now. Because, you see, it's gone.
Do you mean—
Nigel looked shocked.
There's a bottle with Soda Bic written on it, containing morphine, in this place somewhere, and at any time someone might take a spoonful of it if they've got a stomach pain. Why didn't you throw the drug away if you were so upset about it?
Because I thought it was valuable and ought to go back to the hospital. As soon as you had won your bet, I meant to ask Celia to put it back.
So when did it disappear?
I don't know. I looked for it the day before Celia died and couldn't find it.
It was gone the day before she died?
I suppose, said Patricia, her face white, that I've been very stupid. Nigel, do you think I should tell the police?
I suppose so, yes. And it's going to be all my fault.
Oh, no, Nigel, dear, it's me.
I was the one who stole it. It all seemed to be very amusing at the time, but now— Look, Pat, you've probably just forgotten where you put it.
Nigel stood up.
Let's go along to your room and look.
Nigel, those are my underclothes.
Really, Pat, you can't go all shy now. Down among the panties is just where you would hide a bottle now, isn't it?
Yes, but I'm sure There was a slight knock on the door, and Sally Finch entered. Her eyes widened. Pat, with a handful of Nigel's socks, was sitting on the bed, and Nigel was digging into a pile of clothes like an excited dog, while panties lay all around him. "For goodness sake," said Sally, "what's going on?"
"Looking for bicarbonate," said Nigel.
"Bicarbonate? Why?"
"I've got a pain," he said, smiling, "in my stomach."
"I've got some, I believe."
"No good, Sally. It's got to be Pat's. Hers is the only type that will help my particular problem."
"You're mad," said Sally. "You haven't seen my bicarbonate, have you, Sally?" Pat asked. "No." Sally paused. "But somebody here—" "No, I can't remember." "Have you got a stamp, Pat? I want to send a letter and I haven't got any." "In the drawer there." Sally opened the drawer, found a book of stamps, took one, and put some money on the desk. "Thanks. Shall I post this letter of yours at the same time?" "Yes. No, I think I'll wait." When Sally had left the room, Pat dropped the socks and twisted her fingers nervously together. "Nigel, there's something else I've got to tell you. I'm afraid you'll be angry."
"I'm past being angry. I'm just frightened. If Celia was poisoned with the morphine that I stole, I shall probably go to prison."
"It's nothing to do with that. It's about your father."
"What?"
Nigel turned, a shocked expression on his face. "You do know he's very ill, don't you?"
"I don't care how ill he is."
"It said so on the radio last night. Sir Arthur Stanley, the chemist, is in a very bad condition."
"So nice to be famous. All the world hears when you're ill.
Nigel, if he's dying, you should go to see him.
No, I certainly will not. He may be dying, but he's still the same person.
You mustn't be like that, Nigel. So unforgiving.
Listen, Pat. I told you once, he killed my mother.
I know you said so, and I know you loved her very much. But, Nigel, lots of husbands are unkind, and it makes their wives unhappy. But to say your father killed your mother isn't really true.
You know so much about it, don't you?
I know that someday you'll be sorry that you didn't make peace with your father before he died. That's why—
Pat paused.
That's why I've written to your father, telling him—
You've written to him? Is that the letter Sally wanted to post?
Nigel walked over to the desk. He picked the letter up, tore it into small pieces, and threw it into the waste paper basket.
That's that!
Really, Nigel, you can tear the letter up, but you can't stop me writing another.
You're so stupid. Did you not understand that when I said my father killed my mother, I was stating just a plain fact? My mother died from taking too much of her sleeping medicine. They said at the inquest that she took it by mistake. But she didn't take it by mistake. It was given to her deliberately, by my father. He wanted to marry another woman, and my mother wouldn't give him a divorce. It was plain murder. What would you have done in my place? Told the police? My mother wouldn't have wanted that. So I did the only thing I could. Told him I knew, and left home forever. I even changed my name.
Nigel, I'm sorry. I never dreamed—
Well, you know now, about the respected Arthur Stanley. But his other woman didn't marry him after all. I think she guessed what he had done.
Nigel, dear, how awful.
All right, we won't talk of it again. Let's get back to this bicarbonate business. Now think back carefully to exactly what you did with the stuff. Think, Pat.
Chapter 17. Sitting in a room at the police station, Nigel looked nervously into the eyes of Inspector Sharp.
You understand, Mr. Chapman, that what you have just told us is very serious, said the inspector. Of course I understand. I wouldn't have come here to tell you about it unless I had felt it was important. And you say Miss Lane can't remember exactly when she last saw this bicarbonate bottle containing morphine? No, but she's trying to make some sense of it now. We had better go round to Hickory Road immediately.
As the inspector spoke, the telephone rang, and the constable who had been taking notes of Nigel's story answered.
It's Miss Lane, he said. Wanting to speak to Mr. Chapman.
Nigel leaned across the table and took the receiver.
Pat? Nigel here.
The girl's voice sounded breathless.
Nigel, I think I know. I mean, who must have taken, from my handkerchief drawer. You see, there's only one person who—
The voice broke off.
Pat? Are you still there? Who was it?
I can't tell you now. Later. You'll be coming round?
The receiver was near enough for the inspector to hear the voice clearly, and he nodded at Nigel. "We're coming round right now," said Nigel. "Oh, good. I'll be in my room." "Goodbye, Pat." Hardly a word was spoken during the short ride to Hickory Road. Nigel opened the front door and led the way upstairs to Pat's room. He knocked and entered. "Hello, Pat. Here we—" He stopped. Over Nigel's shoulder, Sharp could see Patricia Lane lying on the floor. He pushed Nigel gently aside, then went across to the girl. He raised her head, felt for the pulse, then let the head rest back again. "No?" said Nigel, his voice high and unnatural. "No. No. No." "Yes, Mr. Chapman, she's dead." The inspector stood up. "No. No, not Pat. Dear, stupid Pat. How?" "With this." It was a simple weapon, a stone paperweight inside a sock. "Hit on the back of the head. If it's any help to you, I don't think she knew what happened to her." Nigel sat down on the bed. "That's one of my socks. She was going to mend it." He began to cry like a child. "Do you recognize the paperweight, Mr. Chapman?" Sharp rolled back the sock. Nigel, still crying, looked. "Pat always had it on her desk. A lion." Suddenly, he sat up straight, throwing back his untidy fair hair. "I'll kill whoever did this. I'll kill him." "Gently, Mr. Chapman." Speaking kindly, Inspector Sharp got him out of the room. Then he went back and leant over the dead girl. Very carefully, he removed something from between her fingers. Geronimo looked with frightened eyes at the inspector. "I see nothing. I hear nothing. I am with Maria in the kitchen." "But you can see from the kitchen window who goes in and out, can't you?" Sharp said. "Who was in the house from 6 o'clock until 6:35 when we arrived?" "Everybody, except Mr. Nigel and Mrs. Hubbard and Miss Hobhouse." "When did they go out?" "Mrs. Hubbard, she go out before tea time. She has not come back yet. Mr. Nigel goes out about half an hour ago, just before 6. Look very upset. He come back with you just now. Miss Valerie, she goes out just at 6 o'clock, dressed for party. She still out." Sharp looked down at his notebook. The time of Patricia's call was written there. 8 minutes past 6 exactly. "Everybody else was here? Nobody came back during that time?" "Only Miss Sally. She went down to post box with letter and come back in." "Do you know what time she came in?" Geronimo thought. "She came back while the news was on the radio." "After 6, then?" "Yes, sir." In her room, Mrs. Hubbard, still in her outdoor clothes, sat on the sofa. "I think she telephoned from in here," said Sharp. "Nobody saw or heard the hall telephone being used."
You were out, Mrs. Hubbard, but I don't suppose you lock your door?"
Mrs. Hubbard shook her head.
"So, Patricia Lane came in here to telephone, excited with what she had remembered. Then, while she was talking, somebody opened the door. Patricia paused, and then ended the conversation. Was that because the person who had come in was the person whose name she was just about to say? And then that person went back to Patricia's room with her, and perhaps Patricia asked her about taking the bicarbonate."
Mrs. Hubbard said sharply, "Why do you say her?"
"Just this. Somebody went into Patricia's room with her, someone with whom she felt comfortable. That points to another girl. And if the conversation earlier between Nigel and Pat was heard, it was probably a girl who heard it. Which girls have the rooms on either side of Patricia's?"
"Genevieve's is on the far side, but that's a thick, original wall. Elizabeth Johnston's is on the side nearer the stairs. That's only a thin wall."
"But I've been told that she was already in the common room when Sally Finch went out to post her letter. She did go upstairs again to get a book, but nobody can say when."
"It might have been any of them,"
said Mrs. Hubbard.
"As far as their statements go, yes. But we've got a little extra evidence."
Sharp took a small paper bag out of his pocket.
"What's that?"
"2 hairs. I took them from between Patricia Lane's fingers."
"You mean that—"
There was a knock on the door.
"Come in,"
said the inspector. The door opened.
"Please,"
Mr. Akibombo said,
"I have a statement to make. A very important statement about this murder."
Chapter 18. Mr. Akibombo was offered a chair.
"Thank you. You see, sometimes I have a stomach ache. Sometimes I take a small pill, and sometimes stomach powder. After that,"
Akibombo smiled,
"I feel much better."
Mrs. Hubbard said, "We understand all about that. Now get on to the next part."
"Yes, well, as I say, this happens to me early last week. It was after supper in the common room, and only Elizabeth was there, and I say to her, 'Have you bicarbonate? I have finished mine.' And she says, 'No, but I saw some in Pat's drawer when I was putting back a handkerchief I borrowed from her. I will get it for you.' So she goes upstairs and comes back with a bottle, almost empty. I thank her, and I put a teaspoon of it in water and drink it."
"A teaspoon? A teaspoon?"
The inspector looked at him.
"You swallowed a teaspoon of morphia?"
"But I think it is bicarbonate. And then, afterwards, I was ill, but really ill."
"I can't make out why you're not dead."
Mr. Akibombo continued.
"So then, next day, when I am better, I take the bottle and the tiny bit of powder that is left in it to a chemist, and I say, 'Please tell me, what is this?'
"Yes?"
And he says, 'Come back later.' And then he says, 'No wonder. This is not the bicarbonate, it is the boracic. You can put it in the eyes, yes,
but if you swallow a teaspoonful, it makes you ill.
Boracic? But how did Boracic get into that bottle? What happened to the morphia? Inspector Sharp shook his head.
I have been thinking, said Akibombo, of Miss Celia and how she died, and that someone, after she was dead, must have come into her room and left there the empty morphia bottle and the little piece of paper that say she killed herself.
Akibombo paused, and the inspector nodded.
And I think if it is one of the girls, it will be easy. But if a man, not so easy. So I think, and I say, suppose it is someone in our house, but in the next room to Miss Celia's. Outside his window is a balcony, and outside hers is a balcony too. So if he is big and strong, he could jump across.
The room next to Celia's, in the other house, said Mrs. Hubbard. Well, that's Nigel's and...
Len Bateson's. The inspector's finger touched the folded paper in his hand.
Mr. Chandralal was very angry when his Boracic was not there, and later when I ask, he says he has been told that it was taken by Len Bateson.
The morphia was taken from Nigel's drawer, and Boracic was exchanged for it. Then Patricia Lane came along and exchanged soda bicarbonate for what she thought was morphia, but which was really boracic powder. Yes, I see.
I have helped you, yes?
Mr. Akibombo asked politely. Yes, thank you. Don't, repeat any of this.
No, sir. I will be most careful.
Mr. Akibombo left the room.
Len Bateson, said Mrs. Hubbard. Oh, no. He's always seemed so nice.
That's been said about a lot of criminals, said Sharp. Gently he opened his little paper bag. In it were 2 red curly hairs.
Oh, dear,
said Mrs. Hubbard. Chapter 19.
But it is beautiful, my friend, said Hercule Poirot. So clear, so beautifully clear. Everything fits in its correct place.
Even these? Inspector Sharp showed Poirot the 2 red hairs.
Ah, yes, the one deliberate mistake.
The 2 men looked at each other.
For the other investigation, my friend, it is all fixed?
Yes, for tomorrow.
You go yourself?
No, I plan to appear at 26 Hickory Road. Cobb will be in charge.
We will wish him good luck,
said Hercule Poirot. Sergeant Cobb marched boldly into the pink interior of Sabrina Fair, Detective Constable McCrae behind him. A beautiful creature moved towards them, her feet hardly seeming to touch the floor. Sergeant Cobb said, "Good morning, madam," and explained why he was there. The beautiful creature backed away, and another beautiful but much older creature with smooth hair and steel-grey eyes appeared.
"This is most unusual," she said. "Please, come this way."
She led him through the salon into a room with a big desk and several hard-backed chairs. "I am Mrs. Lucas, the owner of this place. My partner, Miss Hobhouse, is not here today."
"No, madam," said Sergeant Cobb, who already knew that.
"This is her private office, and your search warrant seems to be most unnecessary,"
said Mrs. Lucas. He waited politely until she left them alone. A quarter of an hour later, a safe and the drawers of the desk had been searched, but they had found nothing.
"Looks like we got it wrong," said Macrae. "We're only just beginning," said Cobb.
He took the drawers, one after the other, and turned them upside down.
"Here we are."
Fastened with tape underneath the bottom drawer were 6 small dark blue books with gold lettering.
"Passports."
Macrae watched as Cobb opened the passports and compared the photographs.
"You really wouldn't think it was the same woman, would you?"
The passports were those of Mrs. de Silva, Miss Irene French, Miss Olga Kern, Miss Nina Le Mesurier, Mrs. Gladys Thomas, and Miss Moira O'Neill. The photos were all of a dark young woman between the ages of 25 and 40.
"It's a different hairstyle that does it," said Cobb. "I expect she's got bank accounts in all these different names." "Bit complicated, that." "It has to be complicated. It's not so difficult to make money by smuggling, but it's very difficult to account for money when you've got it. I bet this little gambling club in Mayfair was started by the lady for just that reason. Winning money by gambling is about the only thing a tax inspector can't check. And then, one day, she must have left one of these false passports lying about at Hickory Road, and poor little Celia saw it."
Chapter 20. "It was a clever idea of Miss Hobhouse's," said Inspector Sharp, moving the passports from one hand to the other like a pack of cards. "We've had a busy time racing round the banks, and we've got Monsieur Poirot here to thank for working it out. It was clever of her, too, to suggest that stealing trick to poor little Miss Austen. You saw it was a trick almost at once, didn't you, Monsieur Poirot?"
Poirot smiled. "She could not let pass the chance of possessing that fine diamond in Patricia Lane's ring." "But murder," said Mrs. Hubbard. "I can't really believe it, even now."
"We aren't able to charge her with the murder yet," said Sharp. "She could certainly have poisoned Mrs. Nicolettis, but she definitely did not kill Patricia Lane. The chemist at the corner of the road says she came in at 5 minutes past 6 and bought face powder and aspirin and used the telephone. She left his shop at 6:15.
Poirot sat up in his chair. "But that is perfect. It is just what we want."
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that she telephoned from the chemist's shop."
Inspector Sharp looked at him. "Now, Monsieur Poirot, let's not forget the facts. At 8 minutes past 6, Patricia Lane is alive and telephoning to the police station from this room. You agree?"
"I do not think she was telephoning from this room."
"Well then, from downstairs?"
Not from downstairs, either.
Inspector Sharp shook his head.
You do agree that a call was received at the police station?
Certainly. A call was received by you. A call that came from the public call box at the chemist's.
Inspector Sharp's mouth dropped open.
You mean that Valerie Hobhouse made that call? That she pretended to speak as Patricia Lane and that Patricia Lane was already dead?
That is what I mean, yes.
The inspector was silent for a moment. Then his hand came down with a crash on the table.
I don't believe it. The voice. I heard it myself.
You heard it, yes. A girl's voice. But you didn't know Patricia Lane's voice well enough to say that it was her voice.
I didn't, perhaps. But Nigel Chapman would have known if it wasn't Pat's voice.
Yes,
said Poirot.
Nigel Chapman would have known. Nigel Chapman knew very well that it wasn't Patricia. Who would know better than he, as he had killed her only a short while before?
It was a moment or two before the inspector spoke.
Nigel Chapman? But when we found her dead, he cried like a child.
I expect he did,
said Poirot.
I think he cared about that girl as much as he could care for anybody. But that wouldn't save her, not if she was a threat to his interests. All along, Nigel Chapman has been the most likely murderer. Who had morphia in his possession? Nigel Chapman. Who had the sharp intelligence to plan and the nerve to commit murder? Nigel Chapman. Who cares nothing for anyone but himself? Nigel Chapman. He even wanted to draw attention to himself, using the green ink, and even by the silly, deliberate mistake of putting Len Bateson's hairs in Patricia's fingers. He didn't care that as Patricia was hit from behind, she could not possibly have pulled her attacker's hair. They are like that, these murderers, excited by their love of their own cleverness and charm. For he has charm, this Nigel. All the charm of a spoiled child who has never grown up, who never will grow up, who sees only one thing, himself, and what he wants.
But why, Monsieur Poirot? Why murder? Celia Austin, perhaps, but why Patricia Lane?
That,
said Poirot,
we have got to find out.
Chapter 21.
I haven't seen you for a long time,
said old Mr. Endicott to Hercule Poirot.
It's very nice of you to call.
Not really,
said Hercule Poirot.
I want something.
Well, as you know, I am very grateful to you. You cleared up that unpleasant Abernethy business for me.
The old lawyer smiled.
Sir Arthur Stanley was a good friend, was he not?
Yes, and we've looked after his legal work since he was young.
His death was mentioned on the 6 o'clock news yesterday, I believe.
Yes, the funeral's on Friday.
Lady Stanley died some years ago?
2.5 years ago.
He looked sharply at Poirot.
How did she die?
Too much of a sleeping drug. The inquest found that she took it accidentally.
Did she?
Mr. Endicott was silent for a moment.
It seems so. There was no suggestion of suicide.
And no suggestion of anything else?
Again, he looked sharply at Poirot.
Her husband said that she did sometimes get confused after taking the drug and ask for more.
Was he lying?
Really, Poirot, why do you think that I could possibly know?
Poirot smiled.
I think, my friend, that you know very well, but I will not embarrass you by asking you that. Instead, I will ask you for an opinion. Was Arthur Stanley the type of man who would kill his wife if he wanted to marry another woman?
Mr. Endicott was shocked.
Certainly not. And there was no other woman. Stanley loved his wife.
Yes,
said Poirot.
I thought so. And now I will tell you the purpose of my call. Arthur Stanley had a son. The son quarrelled with his father at the time of his mother's death and then left home. He even changed his name.
That I did not know.
So, did Arthur Stanley leave a letter with you? A letter to be opened under certain conditions or after his death?
Poirot, how can you possibly know the things you do?
I am right, then? I think there were 2 choices in the letter. It was either to be destroyed or you were to perform a certain action.
This matter is private, even from you, Poirot.
Mr. Endicott shook his head.
And if I show you good cause why you should speak?
How can you possibly know anything at all about this matter?
Poirot took a deep breath.
It is in my mind that your instructions are these. If Sir Arthur dies, you are to find his son Nigel and discover if he is involved in any criminal activity.
This time, Mr. Endicott gave a sharp sound of surprise.
Well, as you seem to know all about it, I'll tell you anything you want to know. You must have met young Nigel in the course of your professional activities. What's he done now?
I think the story goes like this. After he had left home, he changed his name. He then met some people who were involved in smuggling, drugs and jewels. I think it was his idea to use innocent students to carry things. The whole operation was organized by 2 people, Nigel Chapman, as he now called himself, and a young woman called Valerie Hobhouse. Everything went well until one day a police officer came to a student's hostel to ask questions about a murder near Cambridge. But Nigel thought the police were after him. He removed certain electric bulbs so that the light would be faint, and he also took a certain rucksack outside, cut it to pieces, and threw it behind the boiler. He was afraid some remains of drugs might be found in its false bottom. His fear was unnecessary, but one of the girls in the hostel had happened to look out of her window and had seen him destroying the rucksack. That did not immediately mean she had to die. Instead, she was persuaded to commit certain stupid actions which would put her in a difficult position. But they pushed that idea too far. I was called in. I advised going to the police. The girl was frightened and admitted what she had done, but only the things she had done. And she went, I think, to Nigel and urged him to admit to the rucksack business and to spilling ink over a fellow student's work. Neither Nigel nor Valerie could consider calling attention to the rucksack. Their whole plan would be ruined. Celia, the young girl, she knew too much. The next evening she went out to meet Nigel somewhere. He gave her some coffee, and in it was morphia. She died in her sleep, with everything arranged to look like suicide.
An expression of deep upset crossed Mr. Endicott's face.
"But that was not the end," said Poirot. "The woman who owned the hostels died soon after, and then, finally, there came the last, most cruel and heartless crime. Patricia Lane, a girl who loved Nigel, told him that he should go to see his father before he died. He told her some lies about his family, and destroyed her letter to his father, but he knew that she might write a second letter. I think, my friend, that you can tell me why that would have been such a deadly thing to happen."
Mr. Endicott stood up, went across to a safe, unlocked it, and came back with a long envelope in his hand. He took out 2 letters and laid them before Poirot.
Dear Endicott, you will open this after I am dead. I wish you to find my son Nigel and discover if he has been guilty of any criminal actions. Nigel has twice been guilty of forging my name to a cheque. On each occasion I said the signature was mine, but warned him that I would not do so again. On the 3rd occasion, it was his mother's name he forged. He asked her to keep silent. She refused. It was then that he put an extra amount of her sleeping mixture into her glass. Before she fell asleep, however, she had told me about the cheque. When the next morning she was found dead, I knew who had done it. I told Nigel that I intended to go to the police. He was very upset and kept asking me not to. What would you have done, Endicott? I know my son is one of those dangerous people who have no sense of pity. I had no reason to save him, but it was the thought of my wife that decided me. Would she wish me to bring our son to justice? I thought that I knew the answer. She would have wanted him saved. But I firmly believe that once a killer, always a killer.
There might be in the future other victims. I made a deal with my son, and whether I did right or wrong, I do not know. He was to write out a confession of his crime which I would keep. He was to leave my house and never return. I would give him a second chance. Money belonging to his mother would come to him. He had had a good education. He had every chance of making a better life for himself. But if he committed any criminal activity at all, the confession he had left with me would go to the police. I also made myself safe because my own death would not prevent that happening. You are my oldest friend. Find Nigel. If his record is clean, destroy both these letters. If not, then justice must be done. Your loving friend, Arthur Stanley.
Ah! Poirot breathed out and unfolded the other piece of paper. I hereby confess that I murdered my mother by giving her an extra amount of her sleeping medicine on November the 18th. Nigel Stanley. Chapter 22.
You understand your position, Miss Hobhouse? I have already warned you—
Valerie Hobhouse interrupted sharp. That what I say will be used in evidence. I'm prepared for that. You've got me on the smuggling charge, but this other information means that I'll be charged in connection with a murder.
Making a statement may help you, but I can't promise that.
I don't really care. I never intended murder or wanted it. What I do want is a clear case against Nigel. Celia knew too much, but I could have managed that. Nigel didn't give me time. He killed her and then told me what he had done. The same thing happened with Mrs. Nick. He had found out that she drank, that she couldn't be trusted, so he met her somewhere on her way home and poisoned her drink. Then there was Pat. He came up to my room and told me what had happened. He told me what I had to do, so that both he and I would have an alibi. I was caught by then. But now I only care about one thing: to make sure that Nigel gets punished.
I'm not sure that I understand, began Sharp.
You don't need to understand. I've got my reasons. Hercule Poirot spoke very gently. Mrs. Nicoletis, she was your mother, was she not? Yes, said Valerie Hobhouse. She was my mother. Chapter 23.
I do not understand.
Mr. Akibombo looked from one red head to the other. Do you think, asked Sally Finch, that Nigel meant me to be suspected, or you?
Either, I expect,
replied Len Bateson. I believe he took the hairs from my brush.
Was it then Mr. Nigel who jumped the balcony?
Asked Mr. Akibombo.
Nigel can jump like a cat, said Len. I couldn't have jumped across that space. I'm much too heavy. I want to apologize for my suspicions, said Mr. Akibombo. That's all right, said Len. In fact, you helped a lot, said Sally. All your thinking about the Boracic. He smiled. If you meet my professor at the university party tonight, will you tell him, please, that I have done some good thinking? I'll tell him, said Sally. Len Bateson was looking unhappy. In a week's time, you'll be back in America. I shall come back, or you might come and study over there. What's the use? Akibombo, said Sally, would you like one day to be best man at a wedding? What do you mean, best man? The bridegroom. For example, Len here gives you a ring to keep for him, and he and you go to church very smartly dressed, and at the right moment he asks you for the ring, and you give it to him, and he puts it on my finger, and then the wedding march is played, and everybody cries. And there we are. You mean that you and Mr. Len are to be married? That's the idea. Sally! Unless, of course, Len doesn't like the idea. Sally, if you only knew how happy you've made me. I do have just a tiny suspicion. Hercule Poirot signed the last of the letters that Miss Lemon had laid before him. Very good, he said. Not a single mistake. I don't often make mistakes, I hope, Miss Lemon said. Not often, but it has happened. How is your sister, by the way? She is thinking of going on a cruise, Monsieur Poirot. Ah. Hercule Poirot wondered if, possibly, on a cruise. Not that he himself would ever go on one, not for any reason. The clock behind him struck 1. The clock struck 1, the mouse ran down. Hickory-dickory-dock, said Hercule Poirot. What was that, Monsieur Poirot? Nothing, said Hercule Poirot.